Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Gavin, how's quarantine going?
It's going. I'm getting my COVID test on Thursday for a little fourth Wally stuff. We are recording this on a Tuesday. So, yep, getting my test done on Thursday so I can escape quarantine. Not that there's really much to do. Uh,
Your
but
escape quarantine and into what?
exactly. Um, but it'll at least be good to know.
Well, of course. And how long do you have to be in quarantine for? You're coming from, was it South Dakota to New York?
Yeah. Technically, either 2 weeks or until you get a negative test. So.
Gotcha. And how long has it been so far?
I got here last Wednesday, so it'll be a little over a week.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, so that won't be too terrible. Is it going to be one of those rapid tests, or do you have to wait a couple of days?
Yep, it's the rapid one. I could have gotten in on Monday for one of the more accurate tests,
Mm-hmm.
but there's such a backlog of them. We didn't kind of trust that it would be back because they say it's supposed to be in about 3 to 5 days. However, one of my mom's coworkers got tested that way, and it took them well over a week. Like the coworker and his wife got tested together. She got her answer back easily within that 3 to 5 days, but he got his back like a week later.
Oh, jeez.
So, I mean, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it doesn't really matter because, like I said, there's nothing to do.
Right, there's not too
But
much to do. You'll be able to be with your family for Christmas regardless. So, and plus this way you'll get your results back, and nothing will have happened in the meantime where you could have contracted it and got, kind of the false sense of security of a negative result.
yeah, absolutely. Although I did, for reference for anyone who doesn't know me, all those multitude of people, I am bald, and so I forgot my razor to shave my head back in South Dakota.
No, no, you didn't.
I mean, okay, I had to have my dad pick me up one when he came back from work today. But so we're
Oh,
all
okay.
good. We're all good. But
Okay. I got worried there for a second. So you're still gonna have that beautiful bald head that I've come to know and love over this last. How long has he been bald now? Is it 2 years?
almost two.
Okay. Wonderful. So I'm glad quarantine is going to be just about done for you guys, and I'm glad that we actually get to discuss a fun kind of, I don't know if this is an addendum or a part two or a totally standalone, but a spiritual successor at least to our episode from last week. We get to discuss Jurassic Park. I know I'm kind of excited about this because I had not seen the movie until I just rewatched it for this episode.
Which I could not
Well,
believe. Oh,
yeah.
okay. I cut you off. For a second, I thought you were going to say you hadn't seen it, and that was going to blow my mind.
For a second, I thought that I hadn't. And I was going to just kind of keep that to myself, but I do remember specifically my seventh grade. As I watched the movie, there were a couple of parts that was like, oh yeah, my seventh grade science teacher, Mr. Mancabelli. If you're out there listening to this, there was a couple parts in there that I remember him talking to us about as he was showing the movie in class, and he loved to show us movies. So, I had seen it before, but it had been so long that I really had kind of forgotten the basics, other than I hope I'm not spoiling too much for anybody here, but like there's, dinosaurs in a park and it doesn't go well, and
Well,
it's terrifying.
okay, number one, the movie is nearly 30 years old at this point, so I think it's well past the spoiler date.
So we're gonna put like the general spoiler tag
Do
on
we
all
really
Jurassic
need
Park.
to? Do we need
I
to?
so I've always felt compelled whenever you're discussing anything, even if it's super old, like there have been people born in the interim who may not have had a chance to see it yet, but who may have heard about it. So I always feel it's important when you're discussing a piece of media, even if it is old enough where reasonably you should be able to, you should be able to have seen it by now, to always say, okay, we are putting the spoiler tag on this. You have been fairly warned because it costs nothing to do that. And I don't know, it might help someone.
Anyway, if you haven't seen Jurassic Park, go watch it. I believe at least the original three. So Jurassic Park: The Lost World, and Jurassic Park 3 are all on Netflix. I don't believe Jurassic World and Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom are. I don't believe they are, but I'm not all that confident in saying that.
And the the first three Jurassic Parks, like they were sort of the originals, correct? And then Jurassic World is the new one with Chris Pratt, right?
Right, and we'll get into some sort of the history a little bit of Jurassic Park as we
The
go.
original
But
book, or pardon me, the original movie was not. It was not an original, actually. If we're talking about this, it was actually a book before it was a movie, which I certainly didn't know. And I know we talked about in our first episode of this podcast just how much that kind of affected you and your development as somebody as a scientist. So, do you want to talk about kind of your discovery of Jurassic Park, whether that was the book or the movie first, and kind of how that led you here?
yeah, for sure. So I'll go through this and like a little bit of history of sort of the Jurassic franchise in general. So I saw the movie first. Like I said in episode 1, I don't believe I believe I was around 8 when I first saw it, but I don't quite remember. And then I learned that it was a book sometime around like late high school. So maybe 10th grade-ish, 11th grade-ish. And then, I quote unquote bought it from my library.
Which is a great phrase, by the way. You bought it from your library.
I mean, they replaced it. So yeah, so I watched the movie first, nearly a decade before I really even discovered that there was a book, let alone read it. But the book itself came out in 1990. Then the movie came out in 93. And so I actually looked more into, because I mentioned that the 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 movie was already basically in production before the book itself was published, and it's because the author Michael Crichton, who, as I mentioned in episode 1, is somebody who I do not wish were dead. He unfortunately passed away some number of years ago, but he was like friends with Steven Spielberg because they worked together on another project. So he was like, "Hey, I'm writing this movie or writing this book," and Spielberg was like, "I want some of that action." So
I
they
still
already.
find that amazing that
Mhm.
that deal was in place before the book was even like
Yep.
out.
Yep. But yeah, so that was book in 90, film in 93. Then sort of a little bit of a hiatus, and there was the sequel, Jurassic Park: The Lost World, in 1997. Now there is actually a second book as well, which I've not read all the way through. It is not, in my opinion, as good as the first one. And the same goes for the movie. None of the other movies are nearly as good as the first Jurassic Park.
Is there
And
a like with the both the books and the movies, was it anticipated there was going to be sequels, or was there sequels because of the success of the original book and the original movie?
I feel like, and granted, I'm not an author, so I feel like most authors would like there to be enough, interest in their
Oh, of
book
course.
to write a sequel. So I don't know what was in Michael Crichton's mind, obviously, when he wrote the first one. I do know that in the first one, spoilers here because the movie's one thing, the books, if you want to read the book, I highly recommend it. It is basically the same plot but very different. Like it ends up the same, but
Okay.
how you get there is quite a bit different from the book. But yeah, in the book, Ian Malcolm dies. So Jeff
Okay.
Goldblum's character dies.
Who
However,
is like one of my favorite parts of the actual movie.
oh, absolutely, he is by far the best character
Goldblum
in that
is.
movie.
I love Goldblum.
At least that's how I didn't interpret it when reading the book as open ended that he died. But he is the main character. If you know anything about the rest of the franchise, he's the main character of Jurassic Park: The Lost World, the second one,
Hmm.
even the second book. I don't remember exactly how he sort of retcons that, but he does in the book, and they sort of write that off as just him not dying in the movie. So
Okay.
that all works out relatively fine. And then Jurassic Park 3 was put out in 2001, so they had a nice 4-year spacing between them. So 93 to 97, and then 97 to 01. There is not a third Jurassic Park book. So what they did for Jurassic Park 3 was basically take some pieces that were cut out from the first book and the second book that didn't make it into the movie and sort of weirdly splice them together into Jurassic Park 3. And you can tell, Jurassic Park 3 is, in my opinion, the worst of all 5 currently released Jurassic Park movies.
I was gonna say that sounds like it's more of a not to accuse anyone of anything, a little bit more of maybe a money grab than like a real strong cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big theme that I'm gonna want to talk about later is how in the first one, they make it very clear. There's a little bit of an exception, but they make it clear that these are just animals doing what animals do. You know, it's a giant carnivorous animal. It's going to eat things. Or with the velociraptors, these are roughly person sized carnivorous animals. They're going to eat things roughly human sized. However, even in the second movie, and sort of as they get away from the first one, that goes away in that they stop being animals just doing animal things and they start becoming movie monsters, which is a real shame because that's one of the biggest things that I loved about the first one.
So that kind of we can take that in a couple different directions. Do we want to talk a little bit about how Jurassic Park kind of changed the way maybe movies got made and how we saw, dinosaurs in movies and in media? Or do we want to talk about how Jurassic Park and the Jurassic Park franchise end up changing the public's view of dinosaurs at large? We can kind of take that in a couple different directions.
So I want to finish going through a little bit more of the history, a little bit,
Okay.
because we're not quite done. So Jurassic Park 3 comes out in 2001. Then there's a long time period. Like I said, there was the 4 years between each 1 and 2, and 2 and 3. And then they go 14 years between Jurassic Park 3 and Jurassic World, which is the first one with Chris Pratt. Now, dislike I don't dislike any of these movies, but they make it very clear that any pretense of these just sort of being animals is gone in Jurassic World.
So these are more villains than they are animals at this point.
Right. And like through the story, it makes sense. You said you've seen Jurassic World, right?
I saw again, like I think I was one of those things where I saw it when it had already been on for like the first 15 minutes had gone
Okay.
by. But I remember seeing the vast majority of like Chris Pratt kind of just being Chris Pratt, which I
Right.
enjoyed thoroughly.
So the main villain of both Jurassic World and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, the most recent one that came out in 2018, so there were 3 years between those two. They're both different quote unquote dinosaurs. I would not call them dinosaurs because they're not, they're completely man made, but they're genetic hybrids, if you can even call them that, because that's not hybrid in like the biological sense, in that sort of like a mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. They didn't take just two closely related animals and breed them. They did it purely through genetic engineering. And any pretense of that just being a normal animal doing animal things is not even attempted to be established, which I am fine with. But it's when they've already established in the first Jurassic Park movie that these are, there's even a line in the first one where Lex, the young girl character, is afraid of a brachiosaurus, a sauropod dinosaur, big, long neck, completely harmless unless it, steps on you.
A dinosaur that I might call a brontosaurus until our last episode, possibly.
Yes. But no, it is a brachiosaurus, and Alan Grant, the paleontologist in the movie, straight up says it's not a monster, Lex. They're just animals, and so they establish that these are just animals reacting to their environment, and the fact that they just repeatedly break that in Jurassic Park, Lost World, and Jurassic Park 3 is what really bothers me the most about those two movies. But anyway, we're getting more off track.
But I just want to make sure that like we are having a focused critique here because I don't think you or I have any problem with movies taking artistic license or really have any problems with the movies sort of on their own terms. But you're more the critique that you're kind of making more than anything else is just sort of the bait and switch that gets pulled between that first movie of there being obviously it's science fiction, but there being sort of this veneer of authenticity to it with the dinosaurs versus what comes next with the subsequent movies, which is they have gone from being dinosaurs as as best understood to being more convenient villains. Is that do I have I kind of summarized kind of that position correctly?
Absolutely. So, one of the clips that I sent you that I don't think you got around to, that was from Jurassic Park: The Lost World.
Correct. I have not seen that one.
There's a scene sort of toward the end, and sort of the Velociraptors are one of the main villains of the first movie, right? Obviously, like
Hmm.
the main villain is the T-Rex.
Of course.
But
But they're supporting character at that point.
yes, so they're not much in the Velociraptors are not much in Jurassic Park: The Lost World until about a 10 to 15 minute clip, sort of at toward the end of the movie, and they are literal just movie monsters. Like they are jumping through glass windows when they, and it's not just like jumping through it to get to something. It's like they're jumping through it to be dramatic. Or at one point, Ian Malcolm is in a car and it is driving its face through the glass of like the opposite. Like if he's in the driver's seat, he's like shoving its face through the broken glass of the passenger side window. And I'm like, no animal, no matter how, unless it is literally starving, is going to do that. Like it could be, a lion, trying to hunt something, but it's not going to shove its face through broken glass. And it's not just like shoving it through the glass, it is breaking the window more with its face to get to him.
And that's something that wouldn't have happened in the first movie, given the way that the dinosaurs were portrayed in that first movie.
Exactly.
Because I wanted to kind of get that out of the way first, was sort of that history of Jurassic Park, and then sort of what you kind of, as a paleontologist, what might irk you about that. And I'm definitely glad that it's not just that it's science fiction, and a science fiction movie uh, wasn't totally scientifically accurate. It's kind of a more nuanced thing where it's like, hey, look, if we're going to do Jurassic Park and we're going to be as faithful as we can to, dinosaurs and science, and then abandoning that for the previous episodes, it's a little bit of a bait and switch that can, I assume, is quite annoying for people that actually know what's going on.
Yeah.
But that does kind of lead us into kind of really well. That kind of leads us into people's view of dinosaurs, which are, you know, they're shaped by lots of different things. The books that you're reading as a kid, or what you are taught, probably mostly in elementary school, is where you're probably going to be taught about dinosaurs and things of that. But also, as with kind of everything, the media and movies and the things that we consume for fun are going to shape the way that we see dinosaurs and, well, pretty much anything else. And so Jurassic Park, I would have to assume, and I could be wrong about this, but Jurassic Park has to be the single biggest way that people get their view of dinosaurs. When you think of a dinosaur in your head, you are probably thinking, consciously or not, of what you saw in Jurassic Park. So, what was it that Jurassic Park did that changed the way people saw dinosaurs? What was it in the Jurassic Park franchise? We can even broaden it from the books to the subsequent movies and everything else. What was it in that franchise that has shaped the way people think about dinosaurs? What comes into people's head when we are talking about those giant birds that went extinct we talked last week, 66 million weeks ago and not 65?
66 million weeks ago?
Did I say 66 million weeks?
You did. I mean, that's still a very long time. Not quite the
Not
66
quite.
million years. That's only roughly a million years.
Gavin, if you said something like that, I would edit it out to make you smart, but we are keeping that in because Mike tripping over his own words is going to be one of the recurring themes of this podcast. So somewhere between 66 million weeks and 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs go extinct. And how does Jurassic Park shape the way that we see what dinosaurs are?
So, as with kind of everything, and this is going to be a recurring theme for things that I say, is that you need to figure out and talk about how things were beforehand in order to talk about how whatever topic you're discussing changed it. So, before Jurassic Park, there had been a really long hiatus in like really popular pieces of media with dinosaurs in them. The last like really popular thing were some of the King Kong movies of like the 30s and 40s. The like black and white films, and where it's literally just a person in a dinosaur suit.
The kind of thing where I would watch it today and think, oh, that's a bad movie.
Yeah, exactly.
To be fair, I've never actually seen like King Kong or anything, but I've seen like 30s and 40s movies, and every time I've watched them, I've been like, this sucks.
So back then, they sort of just because they didn't have another way to do it, they portrayed dinosaurs as almost looking like Godzilla, with an upright spine, just like a human, with a tail dragging on the ground. And this was also partially how scientists had perceived dinosaurs as well, just because, well, the only other bipedal things really that we are aware of are humans. I mean, they didn't really consider birds because at the time they hadn't really established that birds are dinosaurs and that connection yet.
Were they still on the whole lizard thing?
Yes. So they sort of just imagine them as lumbering, just giant lizards with their tails dragging on the ground. There's actually a really good, at the school that I go to, we have a really cool museum on campus. And we have an Edmontosaurus, which is a duck-billed dinosaur. And because it was mounted in the museum, the bones of it were, put together for display back in the 40s. It is standing with its back almost upright like a human, with its tail dragging on the ground, which is not at all how they are seen today. We know for a fact that that is not how they walked. But because it was mounted back then and they had really bad mounting practices back then, we can't remount it or everything would break.
That was going to be my next question. Is that permanent damage that was done?
Oh, absolutely. They drilled straight through the bones to put metal rods through them. Yeah, they did a lot of really bad things back in the 40s. When it comes to, well, a lot of things, but paleontology too.
Yeah, the 40s weren't a great time for, all of humanity.
Yeah, pretty much. But moving on, so dinosaurs today are seen mostly because of Jurassic Park as, if they are bipedal, it is essentially like they were bipedal and then just lifted up their front legs. Their spines are still more or less horizontal. Humans really did bipedalism wrong. Humans are actually very bad at being bipedal. Honestly, we had a whole lecture about this in one of my classes this semester, just how bad humans are morphologically, which again, whole nother topic that I could talk about for literally probably an hour. But
I've actually got some stuff I want to say on that, but yeah, let's hold off on that. We can add it to the list.
But yeah, so Jurassic Park, even though scientists had figured out probably back in the early 80s, roughly, is when people started to sort of figure out, okay, dinosaurs weren't these tail dragging dumb lizard things, and that they were some sort of these more active predators, more potentially not necessarily smart, but smarter definitely than was thought, and much more active than was thought. But as is really common, just because science changes their perception and interpretation of something, that takes quite a while. There's a bit of a lag time between when science collectively sort of changes its mind and when the public changes its mind.
Just a quick question about dinosaurs in general. We're talking about, in Jurassic Park itself, there's all these different dinosaurs, and you said kind of the view had changed from, dumb lizard dragging its tail to kind of that more active view. Is that the case with all dinosaurs? Do we think that's the case, sort of across the species, or is that specific to only certain dinosaurs, or how much variation, I guess, is there in the behavior of dinosaurs that we can tell as best we can today?
So most of it is coming from histology, which is studying tissues, which, for dinosaurs, we pretty much only have their bones with a few notable exceptions. But we can tell a lot about sort of the metabolism of an animal by looking at the, making a cross section of its bones and looking at them under a microscope. So we can tell that most dinosaurs, and granted, I have not, looked at microscope slides for every single group of dinosaur, but collectively, they were pretty active. There are some that we still think were pretty dumb. Things like Stegosaurus, where its head is just so incredibly small relative to the rest of its body, which obviously means that it's got a relatively small brain, and just the problem solving sections of its brain are not especially large. It just sort of was hey, I'm bigger than you and I have these really dangerous spikes in my tail. Don't come near me. They're essentially rhinos.
I was going to compare them to the high school bully, not the smartest person in the world, but you're still kind of afraid of them because of what could happen.
Yeah, I guess that's a pretty good comparison. I try to compare dinosaurs, as we talked about last time. You can't really compare dinosaurs to anything we have today. There's no like good comparison, but like a solid comparison to things like stegosaurs would be things like rhinos. Or I guess those would probably be more analogous to like ceratopsian dinosaurs, like Triceratops actually had horns on the front. We don't really have a big herbivorous animal that uses its tail for defense, whereas there were several different kinds of them running around with the dinosaurs. But in general, Jurassic Park by itself, and Jurassic Park influenced a whole like sort of subgenre of movies about dinosaurs. If you look at movies that came out in 94, 95, you will see a very sharp uptick in movies about dinosaurs just because of Jurassic Park. And so one of the biggest things is that the main sort of dinosaur advisor for the Jurassic Park franchise is a guy named Jack Horner. He's kind of a very controversial person in paleontology.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe I sent you. There was one time I was like watching a
Yes.
TED Talk for fun, and I was like, "Hey, look at this guy! This guy's awesome!" And you kind of very politely corrected me and said, "We need to be careful with Jack Horner."
Yes. So I'm not going to undersell his contributions to paleontology at all. He has done a lot of really good work for paleontology. However, when he was in his 60s, he married a 19-year-old, one of his students, which is obviously not cool.
Yeah, I mean, like there's, I suppose there's lines to be drawn around like, the age of majority and adulthood, but there's also lines to be drawn around just like what's creepy, and there's also lines to be drawn around a professor undergrad student relationship. And I think that
Exactly.
last one is probably by far the most concerning about kind of the power dynamic that was at play there. You or I have never met either one of them, I'm going to
No.
assume,
Nope, I've never met Jack.
but we can kind of infer from that is, that kind of a power dynamic is not appropriate, especially with that kind of an age difference. Yeah, so Jack Horner, controversial figure, but what were you going to kind of say about him?
So he has some, especially back then, had some controversial ideas about paleontology, or which a lot of which did turn out to be correct, or at least have more evidence to support them now than they did then. Such
So not a
as
crank,
no,
not a
not at
total
all.
cuckoo. He is a serious paleontologist. Speaking of him professionally.
Yes, absolutely. So he was a big proponent very early on of dinosaurs being what most people would call warm-blooded, which isn't quite the case. They were sort of in between, from what we can tell, which isn't a lot because that's you need a lot more than bones to tell that for certain. But from what we can tell, they were much more warm-blooded than people think of than like lizards, you know. And so something that's really cool that he insisted was put in, and I want to say he sort of advised the book as well, but I don't know that for sure. But one of the things that he insisted was put in was the scene where the velociraptors are coming into the kitchen to come after the kids, and it's looking through sort of the glass window, and it
Right.
breathes out and fogs up the thing with steam, which is a really small detail, but something that's just sort of really important, and that just sort of people just sort of bought that immediately.
And tell me why that's important. So why exactly is the steam coming onto the window from the dinosaur breathing on it? Why is that important? Why is that a crucial detail, a small one, albeit?
Well, I mean, it's not like it implies that their breath is warm, which means that their body is warm.
And how, so we have this idea that dinosaurs are, warm-blooded, I suppose, in part because of, that one scene. How accurate is that? What is the state of science right now, acknowledging all the uncertainty that goes into it?
Pretty confident, just because generally, so whether they created their own heat per se, such as mammals and birds do, they probably did some, but just larger animals in general need to create less of their own heat, which is why things like elephants have really big ears, because they actually need to get rid of heat, and why they don't have fur anymore, because they're so big that just being that large, you retain a lot of heat. So they need to get rid of some excess heat. So just being as large as dinosaurs were probably made them run a little warm. But even the smaller ones, it's also sort of assumed that, if most dinosaurs had feathers, at least the theropods, and there's even some evidence of some of the early members of other groups. So the theropods being the ones that walk on two legs, the ones that eat meat, such as Velociraptor T-Rex. We're pretty confident in saying that almost all of them had some form of feather at some point in their life. So such as like a baby T-Rex. We don't think adult T-Rexes did, but babies we're pretty confident did. And, feathers are there to keep heat in, which wouldn't really make sense if you needed to get heat from like the sun or just a warm area like lizards do.
So the science right now is pretty suggestive of the fact that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, which is something that may have been controversial in 1993, but is sort of proven to be more in the direction the scientific community is going. Is that about correct?
Yeah, for sure.
Wonderful. So is there anything else, any other ways specifically that the Jurassic Park series has influenced the way people view dinosaurs? Again, either correctly, as it seems to be the case with that kind of famous scene of the window fogging up, or incorrectly, as maybe kind of those later movies have done.
So one thing that I can't avoid mentioning is so I think that by far the dinosaur that they got the most right was the T-Rex, but by a long shot, because the Velociraptors, they're not feathered, which they sort of throw a little bit of a nod to in Jurassic Park 3, in that the male Velociraptors are slightly different colored and they look like some sort of quills on their head. But we now know that Velociraptor, well, Dromaeosaurs in general, which is the group of dinosaurs that Velociraptors and quote unquote raptors are in, and we're pretty sure that all of them had feathers for pretty much all of their life. However, Velociraptor itself is, and most people may know this, just because it's talked about a lot. Velociraptor itself was only about 3 feet tall.
I did not know that. Well,
Yep, so the actual genus, which is what Velociraptor is, was about 3 feet tall, probably about 6 feet long, and is found in only Mongolia and China. In fact, I believe the only species of Velociraptor is Velociraptor mongoliensis. So it's only found in that part of the world. However, the name Velociraptor sounds much cooler and is much more easily pronounceable than what those dinosaurs in the book and movie, because the book gets this wrong too. What they're based off of is a dinosaur called Deinonychus or Deinonychus, depending on who you talk to, but which is almost exactly the same size as the Velociraptors in the movie, about 6 feet tall, about 9 feet or so long, about human sized. So that's one that they get most things right, except for the name. If they just called it Deinonychus, or it could, I guess, be Utah Raptor, which is also about the same size.
Utah raptor sounds vaguely non-threatening. Like this is weird. It's a raptor, but it's from Utah, so I don't know how to feel about that one.
Yeah, so there's a number that they could have, but nothing sort of had the same ring as Velociraptor, So that's why they went with that. The biggest one by far that they get wrong, though, is the Dilophosaurus, the little one that spits venom and has the frill.
And do they get that one wrong because it doesn't exist?
It does exist, but the only thing that they got right about it is that it has 2 crests on its skull. That's what Dilophosaurus means. It means like 2-crested lizard. And even though they're not lizards, that's just the suffix that people use for any sort of reptiles, pretty much, when they give them names. So that's pretty much the only thing got right. So number 1, Dilophosaurus was roughly 9 or so feet tall. This was a big animal. Number 2, there's literally no evidence whatsoever that it spat venom. Literally none.
Is this something where like there's no evidence, but like it could, we just have no idea, or like is there no evidence and like we would know, or we would at least have an idea if they did spit venom?
We would have an idea. So the
Okay.
closest thing. So in order for something to spit venom, it would need, a venomous bite to begin with, right? So the only animals really, I mean, there are a couple mammals, but they're weird. So I'm not going to bring those up. But the closest ones that you would want to sort of consider when talking about that kind of thing would be a number of venomous snakes and then also the lizard genus Heloderma, which contains the Gila monster, and the beaded lizard, the only two notable venomous species of lizard. And when you look at the skull of those animals, you can see visibly where their venom gland is. Like, it leaves a notable impression on the skull.
So this is different than last week when we were talking about something different. At this point, it's not just, absence of evidence. There is evidence of absence
Yes.
of these dinosaurs' ability to be venomous.
Yes. And, the only sort of spitting venom animal that we have, to my knowledge, today is the spitting cobra, which, venom is a really unique compound in that you want it to be really non-viscous. You want it to be very watery so that when you inject it into something, it spreads throughout that animal's body very quickly. And so if you were spitting something that looked essentially like tar in the movie, that would be very not effective at doing its job.
Because it couldn't get throughout the body quickly, right?
Yes. So it would be pretty effective at what it does in the movie, in that, like, if you spit it into something's eyes to blind them, you don't really need it to get through the rest of the body if you're just trying to go for their eyes. But it's like, what? It doesn't make sense. Evolution doesn't do a lot of things without, like, a quote unquote reason. And I don't like talking about evolution doing things, because evolution is just a process. It doesn't, like, have an end goal in mind. But to develop a spittable poison like that, or venom, you would need an injectable venom first. And to have that thick of an injectable venom just doesn't make sense.
So they really screwed this one up. And which dinosaur was this?
Dilophosaurus, it's the one that kills the guy that screws up everything.
Right. Okay. Dilophosaurus, the one that kills the guy that screws up everything.
Yep.
So I guess it's okay in the end.
Well, and not only do they not have venom, they also don't have the frill. That is something that's harder to disprove, but again, it's like there's literally zero evidence for it at all. They just thought it would look cool.
So there's even less of a reason for something like that, because at least with the venom part, like, it serves a purpose for the movie, even if it's not scientifically accurate. Just because the frill itself, it looked a touch scarier with that, instead of having it look more the way that we think that it looked.
Right, and so the whole reason of having a frill like that is to scare off big scary predators. Animals that do that kind of thing are the frilled lizard from Australia, which is roughly a little bit larger than, like, bearded dragon size. They maybe get to about 3 or so feet long, maybe. Not a big lizard at all. And so they do that to make themselves look big and scary. Other animals that do something similar, such as, are like cobras, when they stand up tall and stretch out their hood. There's also a number of snakes that aren't cobras that do a similar thing. Like, there's a snake called the false water cobra, and it's called false because it is not an actual cobra. But enough animals know, okay, if it does this and stretches out its hood, that's something that's big and scary that I should stay away from. So some other snakes sort of were like, hey, it works for them. More or less. Obviously, like I said, evolution doesn't work that way with, like, an end goal, but a little bit of convergence there. A little bit of, like, mimicry is what that's called. So if Dilophosaurus, the real animal, was around toward the beginning of when dinosaurs period were around, in the mid to late Triassic. And so a 10-foot tall dinosaur, especially a predatory one, would be the largest predatory dinosaur on the planet, probably one of the largest predators on the planet, period. So why would it need a big frill to scare off things when it was already there? It is the big scary thing.
There's no need for it to be any bigger and scarier.
Exactly.
Understood. So we've kind of got our basis of what the movie has kind of done to the perceptions of dinosaurs. Was there anything else you wanted to add kind of onto that, just what the movie itself has done to the public, at large, and the public's view of dinosaurs?
Not really, other than just making dinosaurs more popular again. And I'll circle back to this a little bit when we talk about, after we talk about the next point, which is sort of how it sort of changed movies in general.
So let's get right into that then. I am not familiar with dinosaurs, but I'm even less familiar with sort of the cinematic history of dinosaurs. So what exactly did Jurassic Park do to change the way movies are made, and that which is kind of the way you put it in our notes here. So I will kind of let you take this because I'm really interested to find out exactly how this ends up working out. That Jurassic Park changes, cinema in one way or another permanently.
Yeah, so Jurassic Park changed things in a lot of ways. So the biggest three, I would say, would be CG, which, we think today with, recent movies such as like Avengers Endgame, incredible CG in those movies, right? Most of the movie at this point is CG, realistically. However, in the early 90s, CG technology was not great. So Jurassic Park really, you just watched it, what, today or yesterday, right?
Correct.
How good do you think that CG is relative to what we have today?
I was kind of thinking about that at the time. I kind of had in my head, movie came out in the early-ish 90s. And this is like, I'm pretty good at suspending disbelief as is, but even if I wasn't, I mean, they did a damn good job with dinosaurs interacting with the real world, interacting with human beings. Like, I could quibble with a couple of different parts if I really wanted to, but A, I don't really want to, and B, I thought that they did a damn good job portraying or trying to put these, you know, if you want to call them monsters, if you want to portraying these animals on screen in a way that just probably wasn't realistic for all of cinema history up until that point.
Exactly. And so a lot of people at the time, like and the reason why I had heard how revolutionary this movie was, but when I was sort of writing the notes for this episode, I looked more into it. And a lot of people at the time, like in the movie industry, were like, you can't do this. Like what you were trying to do, we just don't have the ability to do it yet. And they did it anyway. And so they blew a lot of people's minds. And so like even just comparing it to something from like, I don't know, mid 2000s, getting toward like 2010, this probably beats most of those. I would think, like in my opinion. And maybe there's a little bias there just because I love this movie so much. But
But
for the
there's
time,
certainly it doesn't give anything up at that point.
no,
At
not
the
at all.
very least, if it's not better than the movies that came after it for the next decade and a half or so, at the very least doesn't give anything up for that period of time.
Absolutely. So this just really changed what people thought was possible for movies at the time. And at least for, if you want to do like a completely animated movie, that's one thing. You know, Toy Story came out not that long after this, and Toy Story obviously looks beautiful, but they don't look realistic. Making realistic animals on the screen was just to this level of detail was something that people just did not think was possible. And Jurassic Park just said, huh, LOL, watch me. The next sort of thing that was also incredible for the time were the animatronics, which makes a lot of sense given that it was like Steven Spielberg working on it, who was really good friends with George Lucas, and all of the animatronic stuff in the early Star Wars films was also incredible for the time. And I believe it was the same studio. I don't know that for sure, but I believe it was the same like visual effects, special effects studio that was working on a lot of the early Star Wars stuff. But the animatronics for the time were just out of this world, especially the T-Rex, which there's a lot of fun stories about. So obviously, in the main T-Rex attack scene, it's raining, right?
Yes.
So they had to stop filming every 15 minutes or so in order to pat dry the T-Rex because its flesh was made out of this like absorbent rubbery material, and it would get too heavy for the crane and stuff to move around.
My favorite part about this is that it's pat drying, so you've got, I assume, just like a couple of interns or whatever, whatever their job title may be. I don't want to
Like a
disparage
small
them,
army of
but
people, yeah.
right, going out there with towels and just trying it out. There's something about that that's kind of charming.
Well, and it's also really funny. So the water, I guess they didn't waterproof the like electrical stuff as well as
Oh
they
no.
wanted to.
Oh
Nothing like
no.
shorted or anything. Nobody got hurt or anything.
But
Sometimes it would just start moving by itself, or it would just start making noises by itself.
this sounds like one of those things that would happen and then it would get into the movie in one way or another.
Oh, absolutely. So and so something that did happen like that is when it's coming down through the roof of the Jeep through the glass on the kids. the glass breaks. That's not supposed to happen. That glass was not supposed to break.
Oh, jeez.
So, like, the screams of terror from those children are 100% genuine, and they just kept them in.
Like any good movie, you should be terrorizing children.
And another, the Velociraptors were also really good. They weren't as good because for some of like the movement scenes, it's kind of tough to have one that small while being that close to it without obviously being able to tell that it is a machine. So for some of it, they did have to have like a person, like for any of like the, close-ups of like the feet when it's running. That was literally just a person with Velociraptor boots on.
Okay.
But something that I think is sort of on par with how good the T-Rex was the Triceratops that they go visit like when it's sick and like passed out.
Yeah, that was towards the beginning of the movie.
Yes, that was at the sort of beginning-ish of the tour that they take.
Right.
People, for some reason, I don't know who actually would be like, oh, that's a real animal, because, it's a Triceratops. But people were like, oh my god, is there a real animal there? Like, was that a real sick animal? Like, you can look up stuff from the time, like people being on, the early form of the internet, being like, did they hurt an animal for this? Because people thought that was a real animal. That's how good that Triceratops looked and still looks.
I'm laughing, me here in 2020, ha ha, people are dumb. But like, if you've never seen something like that before, if this is, a first of its kind, I suppose that's not completely unreasonable to wonder if there's just no other analog to this, which, kind of goes with the whole, this movie really does change cinema and changes, what people think of are possible in movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so the last one of the three things that Jurassic Park really changed was sound. So, granted, we listen to everything in like Dolby, HD, whatever audio today. That's pretty regular for us when we're watching movies. That's sort of built into every movie nowadays, or something better. I'm not at all a sound person, but this was like the first movie to like really use like surround sound and use like really, really sophisticated, essentially modern. This was like the first movie to use modern sound recording sort of equipment, sound recording styles. So it was just really, really impressive and set a precedent for years. Like people in film school teach classes on Jurassic Park. That is how revolutionary this movie was for so many different aspects of film creation.
And so with that, I think we can kind of take just how revolutionary Jurassic Park was with its visuals, with the way those visuals interacted with human beings and with the sound, and putting all that together, and you've got a cultural phenomenon that is distinct from anything else. I don't want to necessarily say bigger than anything else. You had different movies like The Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind or Star Wars, but you've got kind of a distinct phenomenon, you'd have to say, with Jurassic Park, which is going to leave an influence on the society at large when it comes to the way they think about dinosaurs. But it's also going to affect people that want to go into that field. And I think this is kind of a great way for us to start thinking about, okay, we made a movie, it was a fun movie, but this movie had some real world consequences in the field of science. And so I see you've written down here in the notes, this is both good and bad for the science. What do we have to say, or I should say, what do you have to say? Where does this movie kind of leave science? How does it affect the field itself?
So immediately following Jurassic Park, and immediately in terms of science, so within 5 to 10 years after the movie came out.
Right, you take kids that are in high school or so, and they've got to go through college and get their degrees. So
exactly.
That kind of lag time.
This introduced a flood of new paleontologists, but specifically ones that only cared about dinosaurs, which really bothers me because I don't study dinosaurs, but when I tell people I'm a paleontologist, what's the first thing they ask me? They ask me about dinosaurs. And I'm like, yeah, I know more about dinosaurs than the average person, but probably, not any more than a good biologist who just knows things about different, groups of animals. I don't study dinosaurs. I study an ecosystem that didn't even exist when dinosaurs were around. I think I mentioned, I don't remember, I think it was last episode, but it could have been the first episode too, that grass didn't even exist when the dinosaurs were around. I compare grassland, like the fossils that are found at different grassland ecosystems about 10 or so million years ago. Those ecosystems didn't even exist and wouldn't even exist for another, I don't know, 15 to 20 million years after dinosaurs were gone. So, like, I don't really, comparatively, compared to a lot of other people, know that much about dinosaurs, but it's the first thing that people ask me when I tell them I'm a paleontologist. And that's just one of the minor inconveniences to me, let alone the massive impact that this had on science, because those people who only wanted to study dinosaurs because they thought dinosaurs were cool were really not all that interested in the rigors that being a good, thorough professional scientist takes.
And so before we end up getting there, because I do want to get to the harm that was caused to the field, you do have here some good that was in the field. So let's kind of front load this. Let's kind
Sure.
of steel man this side of Jurassic Park being good for the field itself. What was, I assume number one, you have just this influx of people going into the field. And I assume some of those people, would and at this point are good at their job and still doing good science. And so
Absolutely.
I'm assuming that this movie kind of brought in some people that were good to the field. But what other kind of positive aspects does Jurassic Park have on the field of paleontology and dinosaur paleontology specifically?
So, one of the biggest things in any field of science, whether it's paleontology especially, but whether it's, different forms of biology, physics, chemistry, whatever, funding is massive. And like I talked about, I believe in episode 1, if you get accepted, or if 25% of your grant proposals get accepted and funded, you are a rock star. But people don't donate to things that they don't know about. So with dinosaurs becoming so huge, that just turned a lot of heads toward paleontology. And the more people are paying attention, the more people give their money to, paleontology related organizations such as the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, or even just like the National Science Foundation. Like, I'm pretty sure the National Science Foundation gave, its percentage of money toward paleontology was at its highest, probably in the late 90s to early 2000s, probably just because of Jurassic Park. So that is the single biggest thing. And like, paleontology is a pretty underfunded science in general, just because, compared to something like medicine, it's really not that practical. Paleontology doesn't really help that many people, with a couple exceptions of some small fields or like subfields of paleontology. But paleontology is pretty underfunded, and Jurassic Park drastically changed that.
And then allowed, you said that the paleontology itself isn't all that practical. And I imagine that makes it rather difficult to get funding, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. And so, sort of any opportunity you can get a bite at the apple, whether it's because a movie has created interest in it or whatever. I'm assuming that you guys would take that, because I assume some of that money was also going to study horses and everything else under the sun in paleontology, including dinosaurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of it was stuff like institutions would just apply for grants to fund a grad student or something, and just because paleontology was sort of the headline, a lot of organizations would be like, yeah, sure, you got it, regardless of what that particular grad student was going to be working on. So in that sense, really, really cool, really good. um but that's, other than those, at the time, few and far between, a lot of those bad people have since sort of been weeded out, or at least we now know who the bad scientists are. So we just sort of disregard most things that they say. But other than introducing those new good people and all of that flood of money, there really wasn't all that much good that came out of Jurassic Park from a scientific standpoint. Because it also spread a lot of misinformation because then people started, looking more into projects about bringing back dinosaurs like they do in the movie, which is not a thing.
When you go deeper into that when you say that it's not, because I sort of have a note here that I wrote down,
Yeah.
but I want you to kind of explain what you mean when you say it's not a thing, and then we can kind of talk about my question and is it even relevant?
So it spread a lot of misinformation in the sense that, like, granted, this is a really small thing, but it's like if you buy a toy of Dilophosaurus, it's gonna have a frill, which is dumb. Like, even stuff that's not even affiliated with Jurassic Park, the franchise, you could just buy a generic one off of Amazon, it'll have a frill. Most people think that Dilophosaurus has a frill just from Jurassic Park, which, again, Dilophosaurus in and of itself is a very, very cool dinosaur, and that is the first, the first, big carnivorous dinosaur, which is super cool. But that gets overshadowed by the movie. Another one is just the stuff that I talked about with Velociraptor, and that most people think Velociraptor is a 6 foot tall man eating killer machine. Again, not the case. But the biggest one is how cloning and sort of de-extincting animals works. Because there are people working on it. But if you get a mosquito, we'll just take it, line for line from what Jurassic Park does. If you have a mosquito, in amber, fossilized tree sap, that has dinosaur blood, it's not like that blood doesn't also get changed. It's not like that blood is still completely intact. Because A, the mosquito's enzymes and things in it destroy the blood almost immediately. Number one. Number two, DNA itself only has, I'll refer to it as a shelf life, for lack of a better term, of at most like 10,000 years. If you have some really, really unique fossilization sort of parameters, if it's in a really unique environment, you could maybe push that close to a million. It wouldn't even come close to 66 million years. You might get little tiny fragments of nucleic acids, which are what make DNA up. That is what the N and A stand for in DNA. But to be able to piece them back in an order that would make any form of sense to make an animal is literally just not possible. Even with substituting in chunks of frog DNA, or I believe in Jurassic World, they use some cuttlefish DNA when they make the big monster-y dinosaur. Because, like Chris Pratt says, when referring to that big monster-y dinosaur in Jurassic World, that is not a dinosaur. At that point, there is so much genetic mix-up, and that thing, you would have to add so much other stuff that would no longer be what you are calling it as a dinosaur. Let alone, you probably wouldn't even be able to get a, viable animal to begin with.
And so with that, so like the science there is junk science specifically when it comes to creating dinosaurs. But there are, like you said, there are kind of de-extinction projects underway. My understanding was that like there have been one or two animals that have been de-extincted for like 10 minutes before those organisms then died. Do I have that like somewhere close to correct on the current state of de-extinction?
Sort of. So that has been the case for a couple different species, and I don't remember what they are off the top of my head. I know we do have DNA from the thylacine, which is, most people would call, like, the Tasmanian wolf. A larger carnivorous cousin of the Tasmanian devil. It's been extinct since the early 1900s. We do still have its DNA, so we could potentially clone one of those.
That brings me to my question, and I think this was kind of what Jeff Goldblum was talking about in the movie. I think it's right before they go on that tour when they're kind of having the dinner, which is sort of the ethics of trying to bring back these, they're talking about animals specifically in that film, but trying to bring back animals that have since gone extinct. And is that an okay thing to do, that kind of cloning? And does it make a difference if those animals are extinct versus if they're endangered? And this is always one of those things for me where it feels wrong, like it feels like something's off, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Is this eugenics? Is this, is this wrong? Is this, conservation? Is this a way to try and, combat some of the human-caused extinction? This is one of those things that always feels wrong to me, but I have never been able to quite figure out why it is that it feels wrong. So, like, what are some of the ethical concerns that are going to be raised by looking at looking at de-extinction, looking at, trying to recreate animals out of sort of their constituent DNA parts?
So before I get to that, I want to give a little bit of context of some of the uh, projects going on for like de-extincting things, just so I have something to reference back to.
Wonderful.
So there are two big ones that I want to touch on. So the first one is actually, I don't think he is part of it anymore, but it was actually like funded and sort of run by Jack Horner, and it's called the Dino Chicken Project.
The Dino Chicken Project.
Yes. So in birds, I'm not going to say all because I'm not a geneticist, but most of the genes to sort of make a bird look like a dinosaur are still there. So the genes to give it a long tail, the genes to give it teeth, the genes to give it, proper fingers on its hand instead of like the fused up mess of bones that birds currently have in their wing. All those genes are still there. And if you know how, you can basically turn them on. And if you do it right, you can hatch something that most people would look at and say, that is a dinosaur. So before we get into any of the ethics of that, I want to talk about the other one. So the other one is sort of de-extincting woolly mammoths, because mammoths went extinct recently enough ago that we do have, I believe we actually have like a full mammoth genome.
Really?
I don't know that for sure.
About how long ago did mammoths go extinct? Because I think I've heard this before, and it's always surprisingly recently.
So it sort of depends. So the big mammoths that you're sort of thinking of, anywhere from like 10 to 7,000 years ago or so.
Okay.
The last mammoths that we have record of were some small pygmy mammoths on some islands near like British Columbia, like Vancouver area of Canada, on the west coast of Canada. So they went extinct around 5,000 years ago. So basically when the pyramids were being built, there were still pygmy mammoths living on an island next to Canada somewhere.
Okay. And there's a project underway to bring back one of those two.
To my knowledge, it is the big ones. Just because so one of the better environments for being preserved and like preserving DNA for longer is like swampy areas. So like if a mammoth gets trapped in like a swamp or a bog and then becomes basically a mummy, that is really good for DNA. So we have, I'm going to say just for the sake of argument, a full mammoth genome. I don't know if that's technically true, but just for argument's sake, we'll say that we do.
Okay.
So the closest relative to mammoths today is the Indian elephant. They're slightly more closely related than the African elephant is to them. So there are projects about using like an Indian elephant as like a surrogate mother for cloning mammoths. So those are the two big ones that get the most attention. So rightfully, any embryo that the Dino Chicken Project has fiddled with, they have killed. Rightfully so. Because
And why rightfully so? Like I could invent a reason, but just like spell it out for for me and some of the listeners here.
so number one, I don't think that anything that they have had would have fully matured to like hatching, but they have definitely started to grow things like teeth and tails and hands. So one of the big ethical things for me is, okay, with the chicken, it's easy enough to say whoever owns, the chicken will own its eggs, right? That's pretty simple enough. But then it gets to things like the mammoth where it's a little more tricky, because then, so say, for example, just because Pfizer is in the news a lot right now because of the COVID vaccine, say Pfizer is the one that clones this mammoth. How is that different than, say, the bacteria that they use to produce insulin these days, which they have a patent on? can they not just put a patent on that mammoth and package it and sell it to people?
So you are the is like the first ethical concern you're bringing up here, that there could be, because that all of this work, that went into creating, let's use the mammoth example. All this work that goes into creating a mammoth and de-extincting it, that you could then have people that are patenting animals and not, when I patenting living beings and not just bacteria or just something that, as best as we can tell, doesn't really have thoughts or feelings, but patenting other organisms. That's kind of, sometimes a difference in amount becomes a difference in kind, and that should kind of make people a little bit uneasy that we're patenting other, living beings. Is that about where I have you?
A little bit, and like the book goes into this quite a lot, because there's actually a scene in the book where they like one of the ways that John Hammond, like the founder of Jurassic Park, sort of sells it to like the people, like investors, basically, like the cloning technology, is he clones an elephant like small enough to fit in like a bird cage, and he shows it to them, be like, this is where our cloning technology is right now. We can do this. But they go really deeply into the like ethical stuff around like that little baby elephant, because the elephant's not just a normal elephant that's just chilling in a cage, like that's roughly bird size. It changes behavior so drastically that it's like afraid of everything now because it's so small, and it changes behavior in a way that it's also like kind of violent. So it's like, how can we, and they talk about this in the movie, how can we possibly know what is like, what, say you produce that first mammoth, how do we know if what it's doing is what mammoths did? We don't.
We're kind of producing a bastardized version of, of a mammoth, and hey, that would be the best that we have, but it's not a mammoth. It is a human created approximation.
Exactly. And so since we're talking about elephants, so elephants are highly social animals. They learn a lot from their, specifically their mother, because their dad just kind of impregnates the mother and then just kind of goes away. So elephants learn basically everything from their mother, including to the point where, granted, this isn't learning, but baby elephants will eat the poop of their mom, and that's how they get like their gut bacteria that help them digest food. Mammoths, granted, these are their closest relatives, but they're not that closely related. They're not in the same genus.
Yeah, maybe mammoths were more independent, but because you were using, Indian elephants to recreate them, all of a sudden you are creating, a woolly mammoth that has, the sociology much more of a Indian elephant than of a woolly mammoth, and there'd be no counterfactual. There's no other way to figure out if you're doing it correctly.
Exactly. So I've seen people, and there are actually people, some of the people funding this mammoth thing. I want to be clear in that I don't believe anybody who's like funding the Dino Chicken project is like advocating for like actually producing an embryo or producing a baby that hatches and is alive from the egg. I don't believe anybody is advocating for that.
Then what's the purpose of? It seems like if you're putting in all this work and you're just killing them, I don't quite follow what the purpose of that would be then. Is it just to say we could do it?
Sort of, but also just a better understanding of genetics and sort of what genes do what. Because
Okay, so
yes,
this is
we have the full genome of a chicken, but it's like specifically what genes do what is kind of tough to say until you get around and play.
this is more like a proof of concept. This is more of a genetic project than it is a de-extinction project. It's just using de-extinction as the vehicle.
Yes. But with the mammoth thing, some of the people who are funding it, or at least a lot of people that talk about it, are advocating for like releasing herds of mammoth back into like the Arctic. And there are plenty of, and I believe you were actually on a call where I did a little bit presentation for this for a class. And I think that I went over this presentation with you. Am I right?
I This does sound familiar.
So there are really valid reasons for reintroducing large mammals, because there was not quite like a mass extinction that you think of with like the end of the dinosaurs, but there was a pretty big extinction event about 18,000 to about 10,000 years ago, in that just a lot of the large mammals died. Things like mammoths, things like the big ground sloths, things like saber-toothed cats. Basically, everywhere except Africa, big mammals just kind of died. And I mean, people argue a lot over the cause of it, whether it was people, whether it was climate change type stuff. But there's a growing group of people advocating for reintroducing at least surrogates of these animals back into places like the Arctic, because it can help slow global warming in sort of a roundabout
Really?
way that, yeah, in like a roundabout way that I think we could talk about in a different episode. But again, like releasing mammoths, these wouldn't be mammoths. They would just be wrong elephants. Like as cool as I think this technology is, you can't just go around making new animals and then throwing them out there, because you have no idea what's going to happen.
You spent so long figuring out whether or not you could that you didn't stop and think about whether or not you should.
Exactly. Just like that line from Jurassic Park. I think it would be worth making one mammoth. I do think that that could potentially be worth it, just to see. And granted, I don't study mammoths. I don't really know if we already have this information, but just know more about their biology and their physiology, especially. Because if we're just using just a pure mammoth genome that hasn't been messed with at all, and just cloning that and letting an elephant carry that baby to term, then it should physiologically function as a mammoth did, even if it doesn't socially behave like a mammoth did. So getting a better understanding of sort of its digestive system, or different biomechanical things about it, that could be really useful information that we can then apply to fossils and potentially even other organisms, to be like, okay, how right were these previous studies that we just did on fossils, just sort of as like a proof of concept or a check on the science that's already being done on mammoths. I think it could potentially be worth it, but I'm sure you would face many lawsuits along the way from like animal rights groups, because it's like, okay, after you've done these studies, then what? You just kill it?
And that's part of the harm with cloning these animals that are no longer around. I do quickly want to ask you about something that was kind of posed in the movie itself, in that conversation, where the person who owns Jurassic Park in that original movie,
Mm-hmm.
he's saying like, well, what if we had? I think he uses a condor as an example,
Yep.
and he's like, well, look at, we've got condors, and condors, condors exist, but they don't. They're endangered. They are on their way towards being extinct, but they still exist and they're not gone. So what would be the harm of taking something that exists now, but either is on its way down due to human events, due to climate change, which I suppose are the same thing, due to any number of things, or due to just the fact that like they have a hard time reproducing. I've got an image in my head, and we can maybe talk about this another time. But you and I have a friend Mark that loves to talk about how pandas are just bad at reproducing.
Yes, they are.
And so, what would be the harm at this point, instead of taking a bastardized mammoth elephant hybrid, in taking a panda or an endangered other species and recreating that in a lab to reintroduce them into the wild to try and save a species that does still exist? Are there any different kind of ethical concerns that exist there?
In my opinion, it really depends on how solidly we know that we are the cause. And it's funny now that he uses condors, because we have since learned that condors probably are going extinct anyway, because condors are essentially just giant vultures. And giant vultures need giant dead or giant things to die in order to have food, right?
Right.
But as we just talked about, all the giant things are dead. It doesn't have food anymore. That's the main reason. I'm sure humans didn't help, but the main reason why condors are doing so bad is because their food's gone.
So the condors are a less efficient. What was it? Vulture, you said?
Yeah, so it's not that they're less efficient. It's just that they had evolved alongside things the size of mammoths that were pretty plentiful. And when a mammoth would die, it would essentially condors would descend on it the same way that you see vultures descend on, like, I don't know, a zebra carcass in, like National Geographic footage from Africa, you know?
So I think I'm going to try and piece this together here because I can see where you're going with kind of the ethics of this. And then you tell me how well I did. But I'm assuming the case you're going to kind of make is if taking the condor, I'll take, we'll use that as the first example.
Sure.
If there is an animal that is kind of on its way out on its own, as best as we can tell, we don't obviously have the counterfactual of humans not existing, but as best
Right.
as, people can tell, these animals were on their way out for, one reason or another. It is very clear that they probably are not adapted to live in the world as it exists today. I'm assuming that the case is we should not be bringing back those kinds of animals, or I should say, saving those animals through these kind of, laboratory means because of the fact that you are sort of intentionally going against the environment here, and you are sort of intentionally going against evolution, and you are putting these organisms into an environment where they are just not designed to survive and thrive. Versus if you had a different species that is their extinction or their decline is human caused. I'm a history person here, so I'm kind of thinking of like the American buffalo
Yeah.
that was systematically slaughtered for racist reasons. But if you have an animal that is on its way down specifically due to human causes, you have an animal that should still be able to survive in the environment sans human. And so you should then, at that point, it is at least worth the conversation to say, we're going to try and save this animal along with trying to set up some sort of area that will protect these organisms. So we're not just saving them for nothing, but we are not we are not fighting against the grain of the planet. We only need to fight against the grain of humans. Is that kind of the thought process of the ethical concerns you were thinking of?
So if by a protected area you mean something like a national park, then yeah, we're actually already doing that. Back in, I believe, the late 90s, they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone. Essentially the same thing. They were, for all intents and purposes, even though they were not globally extinct, gray wolves were locally extinct in Yellowstone. And I think it is much more worth our time and effort to reintroduce populations that are locally extinct into places where they used to be, or introducing surrogates, things that ecologically do the same thing, into an area where there is no longer a thing. So a really cool example is one that I was hoping that I would have time to talk about, is something called the Toros Project going on in Europe. So the animal that we domesticated cows from is called an auroch, and they no longer exist. However, technically, all of those genes still exist within modern cattle populations. So what people are doing is selectively breeding domestic cattle to basically be aurochs again. And it will not be perfect. They will not be aurochs. It will not be perfect. But they're breeding them to be more wild, temperament wise. They're breeding them to have longer fur, longer horns, and with the plans of reintroducing them into just wild Europe to just be free. I think that is a really cool solution as opposed to de-extincting things, because we at least know how these modern animals should behave and used to behave, whereas opposed to things like a mammoth where we have no idea.
We were, and we've been talking about this for long enough that you'd be forgiven for having forgotten. We were talking about some of the kind of bad for science things that came out of Jurassic Park. So is there, is there anything else that we have not yet discussed that kind of goes with some of the harm that was caused to the field because of this movie?
Not really, just bad people doing bad science, you know. And this has sort of just been a general theme in science lately anyway. And by lately, I mean the last, I don't know, 20 or so years, is that one of the biggest parts of the scientific process is checking other people and making sure that their findings are good and hold up to proper scrutiny, which you would think that like the peer review process for, because it's actually very hard to get a scientific article published, at least if you want to do it in a good journal. There are some journals that have been like demonstrably shown don't really do peer review, and those are bad journals. But if I wanted to publish something in, say, the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, the highest journal in my field, it is assumed that, my peers, and I say this very loosely, these would be people with PhDs that have been doing this for a long time, a lot longer than I have. They would read this, evaluate my methods, make sure my methods make sense. Even if they're not experts on specifically what it is that I'm talking about, the journal would pick people to be reviewers that would at least know what I'm talking about. So they would pick these people, they would check my methods, make sure my methods make sense, make sure my results make sense given the methods, make sure my conclusions make sense given the results, and then be like, yeah, sure, good. However, when those people that you're picking as the reviewers, just because dinosaur paleontology was so saturated with these bad people, a lot of bad stuff got through. Because these people didn't care as much about the rigors of science as they should.
And so you had a bunch of people that, it is one thing for junk science to be published, which, in some cases is just going to happen. Like, even if good people are doing good science, at some point, something is going to get published that
Right,
ends up not being true.
The vaccines cause autism paper, that was a published paper. That was published in to my knowledge, like the best medical journal. That got through. And it was retracted, obviously, but it still got through.
And so good people, can do bad science, but the issue came from because the field was so oversaturated with, substandard scientists and substandard methods that were being used, was that, some junk science that may have been done by good people, but also may have been done by some substandard people, was either not being checked because those people did not care about the scientific method itself, or if it was being checked, it was kind of being checked with a bias towards the sensationalism
Exactly.
that we've talked about before.
Exactly. And so, like we've said, science does not easily lend itself to big sweeping conclusions. Science is a collection of data that people then sort of look at and say, okay, here's what the data currently say. Here's the next thing I want to try. Let's see if it works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But journals specifically, and granted, I only really know about the paleontology journals just because that's what I do, but you will be hard pressed to find a second study of something where somebody looking at so say somebody publishes something that sounds a little outlandish, but could possibly be true, I guess, back in like we'll say 2018, just for argument's sake. I would have an extraordinarily hard time getting my take on that paper published this, like, now, in that same journal, unless I straight up called the guy an idiot, in which case the journal would be like, ooh, yeah, that's going to get us a lot of people to read this, which means they get more money.
And this goes back to what we talked about in our first episode. There's not a whole lot of praise for doing kind of that last step of the scientific method, which is the replication.
Exactly. Replication studies never get published, at least in your typical high-ranking journals. And thank God. And there's a whole. I have a future episode planned. I haven't written any bullets for it, but it is a heading on our Google Doc that we share for episodes for this podcast. But it's money / publishing in science. And I can talk about that for hours and hours at a time in how ridiculous some of the things for publishing are. Mike is currently typing on that in the Google Doc.
I'm just saying hi to Gavin. Well, one thing I'd like to kind of put out a call for is amongst people that listen to this. I think once this third episode goes live is when we're going to start kind of
Yeah.
pushing some of the more audience expansion for a little bit. If there is any work being done, if you are someone that's listening to this that is working on any kind of replication studies, I think we want to hear about it. And so Gavin, we haven't discussed this before, but I hope I'm not overstepping by saying if somebody has any replication studies, I'm perfectly willing to dedicate an episode towards looking at what somebody has done in terms of replicating instead of original research, people that are going through and doing kind of the hard work of the scientific method and trying to replicate findings. And if those are boring findings and said, yep, this person is right, or if it's a little bit more nuanced than that, I would like to just kind of put that out there to everybody and say, I think that I would certainly be quite interested in hearing that kind of science being done and discussing that on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I was sort of getting at before I went off on the tangent of how long I could talk about this was open source journals are becoming much more of a thing. Basically ones that you don't really have to pay for, where it's mostly all volunteer stuff, or at least there's very little administrative overhead compared to something like the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, which has so much overhead that like it costs people publishing a solid chunk of money to get something published in it. And at that point, it basically, in my opinion, becomes, okay, are you giving us money? Cool, we'll publish your stuff, which is obviously not cool. So yeah, thank God that more open source journals are becoming a thing, like online only journals are becoming a thing, because that means if I want to publish a replication study, that I can do that with much less personal cost to me in both, time, paperwork, and literal financial resources.
And that I think is kind of a good place to end up this episode because we have been talking for a little
Yeah.
while, but we can kind of we we can. This is going to be. I'm going to edit this down a little bit, make it a little bit shorter than what
Yeah.
we've been talking for. But this is still going to be one of our longer episodes. But I think it was a good discussion. I think we can just kind of wrap it up with where we began, which is kind of the praise for Jurassic Park. So do you just kind of want to say just a couple of final words as to what this movie has meant for you?
Absolutely. So, like I said, I've kind of ripped these movies a lot in this episode, but obviously, at least the first one is why I got into paleontology to begin with. I love this movie so much, and even the other ones, they have some very obvious flaws. And out of the 5 of them, there is another one being released in 2022, assuming that that's still on track. I believe they put off
Wait,
filming
wait.
a
When you
little bit.
when you say that's currently on track, do you mean the movie or the year 2022? Because either one could be going off track at this point.
The movie.
Okay.
I believe they delayed the filming a little bit, but I think they actually started filming it in July of this year.
Oh wow.
I don't know whether they finished, but it is, to my knowledge, being released in 2022. And so of the 5 of them, I would say 4 of them are decent movies. Okay, I say 3 of them are decent movies. 1 is an incredible movie, 1's a bad movie. So, oh yeah, also one of the clips that I sent you, Mike, the one from Jurassic Park 3 where I meant to bring this up at some point earlier. And this is what I'll end on, is that the worst of the movies, Jurassic Park 3, has the most accurate scientific thing in it. In that
Oh, go on.
there is a scene when they are digging up some stuff in Jurassic Park 3 where one of, who I assume is like a grad student or just a volunteer there at the dig site, says, I don't know what's rock. I don't know how to tell rock from bone. Literally the most
Yes,
accurate
yes,
thing.
yes.
Literally the most accurate thing in any of those 5 movies, by far. Because when you're out looking for bones, you have to really know what you're doing to be able to tell rock from bone when it's like in the rock still. And I just wanted to throw that in there. So even the worst one does have some nuggets of good scientific stuff in there. So they're all worth watching and all are, I think they're all worth watching and all somewhat valid and valuable to science, even if it's just worth talking about in this kind of goofy context like we have been.
So if you are a regular person listening to this and you have not had a chance to yet see Jurassic Park or the other ones, I've seen the original, but I have not seen all of them. Definitely give them a watch. They have the cinema seal of approval from Gavin, and even if you're a scientist, you'll probably get something out of being able to watch these movies and enjoy them. This has been episode 3 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Gavin, thank you very much for this episode. This has been a lot of fun.
Of course, Mike, thank you.
Wonderful. And we will see you guys next week.